The sound came first. Not a sound, really. A feeling. A low, concussive pulse that vibrated up from the hard-packed earth, through the thin soles of Eli's worn boots and into the hollow of his bones. It was the sound of a giant, angry heart beating in the hills. Drums. War drums. They were a sound the town whispered about in huddled, fearful knots, a sound that lived more in legend than in living memory, but a sound every soul knew on a primal level. It meant the world was about to be torn open. Eli Thompson, all of 16 years and scraped thin by loneliness, stood frozen in the center of his shack. The single room was more a collection of gaps than a shelter, the walls loosely planked, the roof a lattice of hope and tar that wept with every rain. It was a place that amplified the emptiness, both outside and in. The drumming grew louder, closer, not a frantic rhythm, but a steady, deliberate one. It was the sound of something inevitable walking toward him. He swallowed, the dry click loud in the sudden silence between beats. The birds had gone quiet. The wind itself seemed to be holding its breath. He forced his feet to move, the floorboards groaning under his weight as he crossed to the door. His hand, slick with a sudden cold sweat, hesitated on the rough-hewn latch. To open it was to confirm the terror. To leave it shut was to marinate in it. He chose to know. The door swung inward with a familiar squeal, and the world outside slammed into him. Dawn was just cracking the spine of the mountains, spilling a weak, gray-blue light over the valley. And in that light, they stood. 30 of them. They formed a silent, perfectly spaced crescent moon around his shack. Their bodies still as the granite stones they seemed to have sprung from. They were painted. Faces of chalk, white and raven black, streaked with the ochre of dried blood. Their eyes, dark and unblinking, were all fixed on him. Not on the shack, but on him. They held bows and lances, their tips glinting like cruel stars in the nascent light, but they made no move. They just watched. A terrifying, patient vigil. This wasn't a raid. A raid was chaos and fire and screaming. This was a judgment. The drums had stopped. The silence that replaced them was heavier, more profound, filled with the weight of 30 pairs of eyes and the question they held. Eli's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the ghost rhythm of the drums still echoing in his marrow. He felt impossibly small, a boy in a threadbare shirt standing on the threshold of his own undoing, pinned by a gaze that seemed to see right through his skin to the frantic, terrified flutter of his soul. His world had shrunk to this single, breathless moment. The boy, the shack, and the silent, painted warriors who had come for him at dawn. And in that terrifying clarity, his mind didn't scream or pray. It fled backward, to yesterday. Yesterday had begun with the same ache of loneliness that started all his days. He'd walked out of the shack, the morning mist clinging to the tall grass, and made his way toward the only place that offered him any solace, the small, grassy rise just beyond the edge of his clearing. 2 simple wooden crosses stood there, weathered to a soft, silvery gray. John and Mary Thompson. He didn't visit to mourn anymore, not really. The sharp agony of their loss to the fever 3 years ago had dulled into a constant low-grade hum of absence. He visited to remember he had once belonged to someone. He would trace the carved letters of their names with a fingertip, trying to feel the echo of his father's hand, trying to recall the exact shade of his mother's eyes, but the memories were becoming thin, like old fabric worn through. He was losing them. The town of Harmony, a raw collection of cabins and a muddy main street a mile down the valley, saw him as little more than a stray. The orphan boy, a charity case who kept to himself in the shack his father had built at the very fringe of their world, a physical manifestation of his social standing. They left him scraps of work, mending fences, chopping wood, enough to keep him from starving, but their kindness was brittle, edged with suspicion. He was an outsider, and in a place like Harmony, outsiders were one step away from being a threat. So, he walked. He walked for hours, following the winding path of the creek, the water a cool, chattering voice that asked for nothing. The creek bed was his sanctuary, a liminal space between the civilized world of the town and the vast untamed wilderness the settlers feared. Here, under the canopy of whispering cottonwoods, he wasn't the orphan boy. He was just a part of the landscape, as unremarkable as a riverstone. The sun was high and hot when he first heard it. A sound so faint he thought it was a bird, a wounded cat maybe. A thin, reedy whimper carried on the breeze. He stopped, tilting his head. It came again. A broken little cry that snagged on something deep inside him. It was the sound of pain, pure, helpless pain. He moved toward it, pushing through a thicket of willows, his boots sinking into the soft, damp earth near the water's edge. And then he saw her. She was curled on a bed of moss and flattened reeds. A girl of maybe 14, her deerskin dress torn and stained with mud and something darker. Her skin was the color of rich earth, her hair a cascade of jet-black silk fanned out around her. A native. A Dakota by the look of her clothes. The town's boogeyman. The people whose land this had been, whose unseen presence was a constant, low-level thrum of fear beneath the settlers' daily lives. Her leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, the bone a pale, sharp ridge beneath the skin, and a crude, bloody bandage was wrapped tightly around her forearm. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, but her eyes, when they flew open and fixed on him, were not just frightened. They were fierce. A cornered animal ready to fight to the last breath. She pushed herself up, a sharp gasp of agony escaping her lips, and tried to scramble backward, her dark eyes darting from his face to the trees behind her, as if expecting more of his kind to emerge. Eli held up his hands, palms open, the universal sign for, I mean no harm. It's okay, he said softly, his voice feeling clumsy and loud in the quiet glade. I'm not going to hurt you. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Her frantic movements stilled, but her gaze remained wary, sharp as a shard of flint. He saw the story in the scene, the hastily tied bandage, the broken leg, the terror in her eyes. She was running from something, and she hadn't made it. The ingrained prejudice of his world screamed at him. Leave her. She's not your problem. She's one of them. What would Samuel Crow say if he saw this? What would the whole town say? Traitor, Indian lover. The words echoed in his head, spoken in the voices of the men who spat tobacco juice in the dust and eyed him with contempt. Samuel Crow, in particular, was the town's self-appointed guardian of purity, a man whose hate was as vast and unyielding as the sky. To be caught helping her would be a death sentence of a different kind. He'd be cast out completely, an enemy within the gates. But then his eyes met hers again. He saw past the fierce warrior in training and saw the child. He saw the raw terror, the same terror he'd felt when the doctor had walked out of his parents' room and shaken his head. He saw the utter aloneness, the feeling of being broken and lost in a world that had suddenly become hostile and sharp-edged. It was a mirror. In her face, he saw his own profound loss, his own deep well of orphanhood. And in that moment, the town, the prejudice, the fear of being cast out, all of it dissolved into a distant, meaningless hum. There was only this, a human being in agony, a child who was hurt and alone. His own desolation reached out to hers across the cultural chasm, and the choice was no longer a choice. It was an imperative. I can help, he whispered, more to himself than to her. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. She flinched, dragging her broken leg, a sob of pure pain catching in her throat. He stopped immediately. He pointed to himself. Eli. He tapped his chest. Eli. Then he pointed to the water, and then to his mouth, miming drinking. Her eyes followed his movements, a flicker of understanding dawning. He slowly knelt, cupped his hands in the cool creek water, and offered it to her. She watched him for a long, silent moment, her chest rising and falling in ragged breaths. Then, with a hesitant, jerky motion, she leaned forward and drank, her lips brushing against his skin. The touch was electric, a small, fragile bridge of trust built in a hostile world. He spent the next hour with her. He didn't know her name, and they had no words, But they found a language. He used a strip of his own shirt to clean the gash on her arm, his touch gentle. He found 2 sturdy branches and, using more strips of his shirt and a leather cord from his belt, he fashioned a crude but functional splint for her leg. Every movement was slow, telegraphed, so she would not be startled. She watched him, her initial fierceness softening into a guarded curiosity. She would wince, her knuckles white as he tightened the splint, but she did not cry out again. He saw the resilience in her, the core of steel beneath the pain. When he was done, the sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. He knew he couldn't leave her here. Wolves, maybe worse. The thing she was running from. He mimed lifting her, pointing back in the direction of his shack. A question. Her eyes widened slightly, fear and uncertainty warring in them. She looked back into the woods, the direction she'd come from, and a shadow passed over her face. Whatever was back there was worse than the risk he presented. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Lifting her was an ordeal. She was light, but carrying a person through tangled woods is a clumsy, agonizing business. He tried to be careful, but every jolt sent a fresh wave of pain through her, and he could feel her tremors of agony against his own body. By the time he staggered into the clearing around his shack, the last light was gone and the world was bathed in moonlight. He settled her on his own cot, a thin mattress stuffed with straw, the only soft thing he owned. She was exhausted, her body limp, her eyes clouded with pain. He gave her water, a piece of hard bread he'd been saving, which she accepted with a quiet dignity. He built up the fire in the small hearth, and then sat on the floor across the room, watching her. In the flickering firelight, her features softened. She was just a girl. He was just a boy. 2 solitary ships passing in a vast, dark ocean, who had, for a moment, found the same harbor. She drifted into an exhausted sleep, and he kept watch, the weight of his decision settling upon him. He had crossed a line. He had brought the wilderness, the town's greatest fear, inside his home. He had chosen compassion over safety, and he had no idea what the consequences would be. He only knew, as he watched her sleep, that the crushing weight of his own loneliness had lifted, just a little. For the first time in 3 years, he was not entirely alone in his shack. And now, standing in the doorway, with 30 warriors as his witness, he understood. They hadn't come for a random settler. They hadn't come to burn and pillage. They knew. Somehow they knew she was here. They had come for her, and he was the boy standing in their way. The central warrior, a man whose sheer presence seemed to bend the light around him, took a single step forward. He was taller than the others, his face a mask of stern, unforgiving lines painted in black and white. He carried no bow, only a long, heavy-bladed lance. His eyes, deep-set and burning with a cold fire, met Eli's. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The air crackled with his unspoken question. Where is she? Eli's blood ran cold. He thought of the girl inside, so fragile and broken. He thought of what these men, in their righteous fury, might do to him for daring to touch her, to bring her into his filthy settler hovel. But then he remembered the look in her eyes, the silent plea, the shared moment of orphanhood. He had made his choice at the creek. He couldn't unmake it now. Straightening his shoulders, taking a breath that felt like swallowing broken glass, Eli did the only thing he could think to do. He stepped back, pulling the door wider in a clear gesture of invitation. He was hiding nothing. He was terrified, but he would not be a coward. He had offered her sanctuary, and he would not abandon her now, even at the precipice of his own death. He stood his ground, his heart a trapped bird beating against the cage of his ribs, and waited for the judgment to fall. The shack, which had always felt like a cage of poverty, now felt like a tomb. The air inside was thick and close, smelling of wood smoke, dust, and the faint metallic tang of dried blood. Eli stood by the door, his back pressed against the rough planks, while the girl, he still didn't know her name, watched him from the cot. Her eyes were wide, luminous in the dim light filtering through the gaps in the walls. The silence outside was absolute. The 30 warriors had not moved, had not made a sound. They were simply there, a ring of silent, inexorable pressure. Eli could feel their gaze through the very wood of the walls, a physical weight on his shoulders. He didn't understand. If they had come for her, why hadn't they stormed the shack? Why the silent, watchful waiting? He glanced over at the girl. She had pushed herself up, her face a pale oval in the gloom. The fear was still there, etched into the fine lines around her eyes, but it was tempered with something else. A question. She looked from Eli to the single, grimy window that faced the woods, and then back to Eli. He tried to offer her a reassuring smile, but it felt like a grimace, a cracking of dry earth. He was 16 years old and had never been in a fight in his life. His only weapons were a wood axe and a skinning knife. Outside, 30 of the most feared warriors on the plains were waiting for... What? He didn't know, and the not knowing was a special kind of torture. He crossed the small room, his footsteps unnaturally loud, and knelt by her cot. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice a low whisper. She obviously couldn't understand him, but the impulse to speak, to connect, was overwhelming. She watched his lips move, then her gaze dropped to the splint on her leg. She touched it lightly, her fingers tracing the line of the branch he'd chosen. Then she looked up at him, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear or suspicion. Gratitude. It was a fleeting, fragile thing, but it was there. She reached out with her uninjured arm and touched the sleeve of his shirt, the place where he had torn the fabric for her bandage. A silent acknowledgement, a shared secret. In that small gesture, the cavernous space of the shack seemed to shrink, drawing them closer. They were two different worlds, a boy from a hardscrabble settlement and a girl from a proud nomadic nation, but in that moment, they were the same. They were the children lost in the woods. He found himself telling her about his parents, his voice barely a murmur. He spoke of the crosses on the hill, of the suffocating loneliness, of the way the town looked through him. He didn't know why he was telling her this. Maybe it was because she couldn't understand the words, only the feeling behind them, the soft, mournful cadence of his voice. He was speaking to the part of her that mirrored his own emptiness. And she listened. She didn't look away. Her dark eyes held his, and he felt, in a way he had never felt with anyone in harmony, seen. A sudden violent sound shattered the fragile peace. Bang, 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 heavy, insistent pounding on the front door. Eli jumped to his feet, his heart leaping into his throat. A voice, thick with gravel and malice, tore through the air. "Thompson! Eli Thompson, you in there, boy? Open this door!" Samuel Crow. The blood drained from Eli's face. Of all the people in Harmony, it had to be him. Crow was a blacksmith by trade, a thick, barrel-chested man with hands like hammers and a heart to match. He saw the world in black and white, settler and savage, Christian and heathen, us and them. And he was the self-appointed shepherd of that grim world-view. The girl, Ayanna, he would later learn her name was Ayanna, let out a small, terrified gasp. She understood the tone, if not the words, the angry shouts, the violent pounding. It was the sound of the world he had come from, and it was just as terrifying as the silent warriors outside. "I know you're in there, boy," Crow roared, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Saw your light on all night. Folks are talking. Say you've been acting strange. You bringing trouble to this town?" The door shuddered again under the force of a heavy kick. The wood groaned, the latch straining. Eli stared at it, paralyzed. He was trapped. If he opened the door, Crow would see the girl. He would be branded a traitor, and God only knew what a mob led by Crow would do to them both. If he didn't open it, Crow would eventually break it down, his suspicion confirmed, and his rage stoked. As if the situation weren't impossible enough, a flicker of movement at the small side window caught Eli's eye. He turned his head slowly, a cold dread creeping up his spine. Peering through the grimy pane of glass, just beyond the edge of the trees, was a face. It was not one of the 30 warriors who surrounded the front of the shack. This face was different. Painted in jagged red and black streaks that mimicked a snarling animal. The eyes were narrowed, filled with a predatory gleam, a chilling, venomous hatred. The man held up a hand, and Eli saw that 2 of his fingers were missing. A rival warrior. The one she had been running from. He wasn't alone. Another face appeared beside him, and another. They were not silent and patient like Dakota's men. They were coiled like snakes, their bodies tense, their gazes fixed on the shack with a hungry, violent intensity. They were the hunters, and they had found their prey. Ayanna saw the direction of his horrified stare. She pushed herself up further, her face ashen, and looked toward the window. A choked sob escaped her. She began to speak in a fast, desperate torrent of her own language, her words sharp and panicked. She pointed a trembling finger toward the window, then held up 2 fingers, a look of pure terror on her face. 2 fingers. It must be their leader's name. She was confirming his worst fear. These were the men who had broken her leg, who had left her for dead. And they were back. The world contracted to the 4 walls of the shack. In front, Samuel Crow and the righteous, violent prejudice of his own people, about to splinter the door. At the side, a pack of killers, their eyes promising a brutal, agonizing death. And all around, the 30 silent Dakota warriors, their purpose still a terrifying, unreadable mystery. Eli felt a wave of vertigo. There was no escape. Every direction led to death. The front door was certain doom at the hands of Crow. The side window led to the killers in the woods. The back wall was his only hope. It faced the steepest part of the hill behind the shack, a tangle of rocks and thorny brush. It was a fool's hope, an impossible escape, but it was the only one he had. "Thompson, I'm giving you to the count of 3, Crow bellowed from the other side of the door. 1! A splintering crack echoed as his boot connected with the wood again. The latch was giving way. Eli scrambled to the back of the shack, his mind racing. There was no back door, only a small shuttered opening he used to toss out wood shavings. It was barely big enough for him to squeeze through, let alone with an injured girl. 2! The door shuddered violently. He could hear the metal of the latch groaning, screeching in protest. He turned to Ayanna, his eyes wide with desperation. He pointed to the small window, then to himself, then to her. "We have to go, now." She understood immediately. The fear in her eyes was sharp, but it was the fear of a fighter, not a victim. She nodded, her jaw set. He ripped the flimsy shutter off its leather hinges. Outside, the world was a wall of green and brown, the steep hillside rising almost vertically. The sound of crows counting was the ticking clock of their demise. 3! With a final explosive crack, the front door burst inward, slamming against the wall. Light and the broad, furious silhouette of Samuel Crow filled the doorway, but they were already moving. Eli threw himself out the small opening first, scraping his back and side on the rough-cut wood. He landed in a heap on the damp earth, the shock of the fall jarring his teeth. He scrambled to his feet and turned back, reaching in for Ayanna. "Come on!" he urged, his voice a raw whisper. She dragged herself to the edge of the cot, and then to the floor, her face a mask of agony as she pulled her splinted leg behind her. She reached the window, her hands clawing at the frame. He grabbed her under the arms, his muscles screaming in protest, and pulled. It was a clumsy, desperate struggle. She was half in, half out, her injured leg snagging on the frame. He could hear Crow's enraged roar from inside the shack. "What in God's name? It's a squaw! He's got a squaw in here! Traitor!" Eli gave one last desperate heave, and Ayanna tumbled out, landing in a heap beside him. He didn't wait. He scooped her into his arms, a fireman's carry, the way his father had taught him to carry sacks of grain, and started scrambling up the hill. Her dead weight was a crushing burden, her small gasps of pain stabbing at his conscience with every step. Branches whipped at his face, Thorns tore at his clothes and skin. The landscape that had once been his refuge, his place of solace, was now a hostile, grasping enemy. It fought him for every inch. Behind them, he could hear Crow crashing out of the shack, his voice raised in a full-throated cry of alarm and hatred. "He's getting away! The boy's a traitor! He's with them!" Eli's lungs burned, his legs turning to lead. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Crow was clawing his way up the hill behind them, his face purple with rage. But that wasn't the worst of it. From the side, from the woods where he'd seen them watching, the rival warriors emerged. They moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, their painted faces like demonic masks flashing between the trees. They were fanning out, cutting off any chance of escape to the sides. They were herding him, driving him. He didn't know where. He just knew he had to keep moving, had to get away from the immediate threat of Crow's brute strength and the killer's silent menace. He broke through the tree line at the top of the small hill and found himself on a familiar path, the one that led down to the creek bed, his sanctuary. But there was no sanctuary now. It was a trap. He half ran, half stumbled down the steep embankment, his feet slipping on loose scree and wet leaves. He reached the bottom, his legs shaking uncontrollably, and set Ayanna down gently behind a large, moss-covered boulder. He leaned against it, chest heaving, trying to suck air into his starving lungs. He could hear them coming. Crow, clumsy and loud, crashing through the brush from the top of the embankment behind them. And the others, the rival warriors, their soft footfalls now audible as they closed in from the opposite side of the creek. He peered around the edge of the boulder. There, blocking the path down the creek, stood the warrior with the missing fingers. 2 fingers. He was flanked by 4 others, their weapons held at the ready. They weren't rushing. They were savoring this. They had them. He glanced back up the embankment. Samuel Crow slid the last few feet in a shower of dirt and rocks, his face streaked with sweat and grime, his eyes wild with a righteous fury. He held a large, gnarled branch like a club. They were cornered. The creek bed, the place where destinies crossed, had become their execution ground. Behind them, the furious settler who embodied the hatred of an entire town. In front of them, the savage killers who had hunted this girl across the wilderness. There was nowhere left to run. The landscape had shrunk to this single, hopeless point. Ayanna pulled herself closer to him, her hand finding his. Her fingers were cold, but her grip was firm. A silent, final act of solidarity. Eli looked from Crow's snarling face to the cold, predatory eyes of 2 fingers. This was it. The midpoint of their flight had become the end. His brave, desperate attempt to save her had only led them to a more certain death. A profound, soul-crushing despair washed over him. He had tried to do the right thing. He had chosen compassion, and this was his reward. He stood up, moving to place his own body in front of Ayanna's, a useless, pathetic shield. He had nothing left but this one, final, defiant gesture. He would not let them see his fear. He would face them on his feet. The world went silent, the only sound, the rushing of the creek, and the pounding of his own blood in his ears. It was over. Then the sound came. It was not the low, angry heartbeat of the war drums. This was something else entirely. A single piercing note, long and powerful, that blasted from the mountains above. It was the sound of a horn, a sound of such force and authority that it seemed to shake the very stones beneath their feet. It was a sound that didn't ask for attention, but commanded it. It was the sound of an avenging spirit descending upon the world. Everyone froze. Samuel Crow, his club half raised, looked up towards the mountain, his face a mask of confusion. The rival warriors, 2 fingers and his men, spun around, their predatory confidence instantly evaporating, replaced by a sudden, stark terror. Their eyes darted nervously towards the high ridges that overlooked the creek. Eli followed their gaze, and he saw them. Cresting the ridge, silhouetted against the morning sky, was a line of mounted warriors. At their head was the tall, stern-faced warrior from that morning, the one who had taken a step toward his shack. But he was not on foot now. He was on a magnificent war horse, a powerful beast that seemed carved from the same granite as its rider. This was Chief Dakota. He held his great lance aloft, its tip catching the sun, and behind him, stretching along the ridge, were the rest of his 30 warriors, all mounted, all armed, all radiating an aura of absolute, lethal power. They didn't charge down in a chaotic flood. They descended with a terrifying, disciplined precision, their horses navigating the steep, treacherous terrain as if it were flat ground. They moved not like men, but like a force of nature, a rockslide, an avalanche, an inescapable tide of retribution. They were the answer to the silent question Eli had been asking all morning. They had not been waiting for him. They had been waiting for this, for the hunters to reveal themselves, for the trap to be sprung. The rival warriors, who had seemed so menacing only moments before, were now a pack of startled jackals facing down a pride of lions. Two Fingers screamed an order in his own tongue, and his men broke, scattering in panic. They tried to flee back up the creek, but it was too late. Dakota's warriors were on them in a heartbeat. The fight, if it could be called that, was a whirlwind of brutal, efficient violence. It was over almost before it began. There was no sport in it, no honor. It was an extermination. The air filled with the thud of hooves, the crack of war clubs, the short, sharp cries of dying men. Eli instinctively threw himself over Ayanna, shielding her body with his own as the chaos erupted around them. He pressed her face into his chest, trying to block out the horrific sounds, the visceral reality of what was happening just feet away. He could feel the ground tremble as horses thundered past. He squeezed his eyes shut, his world reduced to the feeling of Ayanna's small, trembling body beneath him and the cacophony of swift, merciless death. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was silent again. The only sounds were the panting of horses and the ceaseless murmur of the creek, which now ran with streaks of crimson. Eli risked opening his eyes. Two Fingers and his men were gone. In their place stood the silent mounted warriors of Dakota's band, their lances stained red, their faces grim and unreadable. Samuel Crow stood frozen where he was, his face slack-jawed with terror, the branch fallen from his nerveless fingers. He looked from the dead warriors to the mounted Dakota, and then to Eli, a dawning, horrified understanding in his eyes. He had stumbled into the middle of a war he did not understand, and had chosen the losing side. A shadow fell over Eli. He looked up. Chief Dakota had dismounted and was standing over them. He was even larger up close, a mountain of a man whose presence was overwhelming. His eyes, dark and piercing, were not on Ayanna, they were on Eli. The chief's gaze was a physical thing, scrutinizing him, weighing him, peeling back the layers of his fear and exhaustion to see what lay at the core. He saw the torn shirt, the bloody scratches, the boy who had shielded his daughter with his own body. Eli's heart hammered. He had survived the fight, but he felt as though his real trial had just begun. This was the man whose daughter he had taken. This was the father, the king, the judge. Dakota gestured with his chin, and two of his warriors seized Samuel Crow, who yelped in terror but offered no resistance. They bound his hands with a leather thong. Then Dakota knelt. He did not look at Eli. He looked at Ayanna, and his face, which had been a mask of stone, softened with an expression of such profound love and relief that it took Eli's breath away. He spoke to her in their language, his voice a low, gentle rumble. Ayanna answered, her voice weak at first, then growing stronger, more passionate. She spoke for a long time, her eyes flashing between her father and Eli. She pointed to her splinted leg, to the clean bandage on her arm. She pointed to the shack on the hill, and then to the spot where Eli had shielded her. Her words were a torrent, an impassioned flood of explanation, of defense, of testimony. When she finished, an exhausted silence fell. Dakota remained kneeling for a long moment, his gaze on his daughter. Then he slowly rose and turned his full attention back to Eli. He studied him again, a long, unblinking appraisal. Eli met his gaze, his terror giving way to a strange, weary calm. He had done what he had done. He could not change it. Finally, Dakota spoke, his voice deep and resonant. He spoke a few words to one of his warriors, a man with a kind, weathered face, who then turned to Eli. "He is Dakota, chief of the Ahangtanwan Dakota," the warrior said, his English slow and deliberate, but clear. "This is his daughter, Ayana. She tells him you found her. She tells him you showed her kindness when your people would have shown her death. You bound her wounds, you gave her sanctuary, you protected her with your body." The warrior paused, letting the words sink in. "For this, he thanks you." A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled his knees washed over Eli. But the warrior wasn't finished. His expression grew grave. "Dakota also says, the man you call Crow did not stop at the hill. He ran back to your town. He has told them a story. He has told them you conspired with the Wikoti Ogle, the dog-faced ones, who hunted Ayana. He has told them you lured them here, that you are a traitor to your people, responsible for this bloodshed. He has turned every heart in your village against you. They are gathering now. They are waiting for you. For you, the fight is won," the translator said, his eyes filled with a strange pity. "But the war for your home, it is lost. You have no home to return to." The words hit Eli like a physical blow. Saved. He had been saved from certain death, only to be sentenced to a life of exile. The gratitude he had felt moments before curdled into a new kind of despair. He looked up past the creek bed, in the direction of Harmony, the town that had never truly been his home, but was the only one he had ever known. Now it was a fortress with its gates barred to him forever. He had won the battle in the creek, but in doing so, he had been utterly and irrevocably vanquished. He was more of an orphan now than he had ever been before. Dakota watched the play of emotions on Eli's face, the brief flash of relief, the crushing blow of realization, the final, weary resignation. He saw a boy who had been given a reprieve from death only to be handed a life sentence of isolation. He saw a kindred spirit to the loneliness in his own daughter's eyes when he had found her. He turned to Ayana, who was watching Eli with an expression of fierce, protective loyalty. She spoke again, her voice soft but insistent, her gaze unwavering on her father's face. She gestured toward Eli, then placed a hand over her own heart. She spoke of courage not measured in battle, but in kindness, of a strength that chose compassion in the face of fear. Dakota listened, his stern features unmoving, but a new light was dawning in his eyes. When she was finished, he looked at Eli, and for the first time, Eli did not see a chief or a judge. He saw a father. The translator stepped forward again, his voice now holding a different tone, one of reverence and awe. "Ayana has told her father what is in your heart," he said. "She says you did not act like one of the Wasichu, the white settlers. She says you have the heart of a Dakota warrior, one who protects the weak, who honors the helpless. She says you did for her what one of our own would have done." The air grew still. The weight of the moment was immense. Dakota took a step closer to Eli. He was no longer scrutinizing him. He was seeing him. "My daughter's life is the most precious thing in this world to me," Dakota said, his own voice low, and the translator relayed the words with solemnity. "You saved it. The debt I owe you cannot be paid with horses or hides. An act of such honor demands an honorable reward." Dakota paused, his gaze sweeping over Eli's thin frame, his tattered clothes, his solitary existence. He saw the shack on the hill, a monument to loneliness. He saw the boy who had no one. "Your people have cast you out. They call you traitor. They leave you with nothing. We do not cast out those who show courage. We bring them closer." He placed a heavy hand on Eli's shoulder. The touch was not threatening. It was grounding, a surprising weight of acceptance. "I have a son who was taken by the sickness your people brought to these lands. My heart has a space that has long been empty. Ayana says you are an orphan, a boy with no family. I say this is no longer true." Dakota's voice deepened, imbued with the absolute authority of his station. "I, Dakota, chief of the Ihangtanwan, father of Ayana, offer you this choice. You can walk away, a ghost in a land that will not have you, or you can have a new life. I offer you a place in my family. I offer you a home in my lodge. I offer to call you son. The words hung in the air, so monumental, so utterly reality-altering that Eli could not at first process them. Son, family, home. The words he had only ever associated with the two gray crosses on the hill, the things he had ached for with every fiber of his being. He looked at Ayana, who was watching him with tears shimmering in her eyes, a hopeful, pleading smile on her face. He looked at the translator, whose face was filled with a quiet respect. He looked at the 30 warriors surrounding them, their faces no longer terrifying masks, but solemn, stoic witnesses to this sacred pact. And he looked at Dakota, the powerful chief who was offering him the one thing in the world he thought he could never have again: a place to belong. The choice was not a choice. It was a lifeline. It was salvation. His throat was tight, his own eyes burning with unshed tears. He could not find the words, so he did the only thing he could. He gave a single profound nod, a silent acceptance, a quiet homecoming. Dakota's stern face broke into a rare, small smile. He squeezed Eli's shoulder once more, a gesture of finality, of welcome. He issued a series of quiet commands. The bound and terrified Samuel Crow was hauled onto a horse. 2 warriors gently lifted Ayana, crafting a makeshift seat for her on a sturdy pony. Another brought a horse for Eli. As he was helped into the saddle, he felt a strange sense of unreality, as if he were watching himself in a dream. The procession began to move, leaving the creek bed and its grim tableau behind, climbing back up toward the high mountain passes. As they rode, Ayana's pony was brought alongside his. She reached out and took his hand, her grip warm and sure. She didn't say anything, but her smile was radiant. It said everything. Brother. The rest of the day passed in a blur of motion and overwhelming sensation. The ride into the mountains, the crisp, clean air, the endless expanse of sky. They arrived at the Dakota camp as the sun was setting, a sprawling village of painted teepees nestled in a hidden, high meadow valley. It was a world of smoke and laughter, of children and dogs, of life lived in vibrant, close-knit community. He was taken to Dakota's lodge, the largest in the village, and given food, rich, savory buffalo stew that warmed him to his core. He was given new clothes, soft deerskin that felt like a second skin after his own rough, torn garments. He sat by the fire, Ayana beside him, her father across from them, and though he understood little of the language, he understood the feeling of safety, of peace, the feeling of being home. Exhaustion finally claimed him, and he was shown to a pile of soft furs, where he fell into the first deep, dreamless sleep he had known in years. He woke slowly, the morning light filtering softly through the stretched hide of the teepee. For a moment he was disoriented, the unfamiliar smells and sounds confusing him. Then the memory of yesterday rushed back, not as a nightmare, but as a miracle. He sat up. Ayana was still asleep nearby, her breathing soft and even. Dakota was gone. Eli rose quietly and pushed aside the flap of the teepee, stepping out into the cool morning air, and his breath caught in his chest. There, in the same silent crescent formation as the morning before, stood the 30 warriors. They were not painted for war. Their faces were bare, their expressions calm. Their bows were slung over their shoulders, their lances at rest. They were not surrounding him as a threat. They were standing guard over the chief's lodge, over his lodge. They were not his judges. They were his protectors, his family. The translator from the day before approached him, a warm smile on his face. "Dakota has gone to council," he said. "He will return soon. Ayana will show you the camp when she wakes." He gestured toward the edge of the camp, which overlooked the vast valley below. From this vantage point, Eli could see for miles. He could see the tiny, insignificant scar on the landscape that was the town of Harmony. And as he watched, he saw a rider, a lone figure on a horse, galloping away from the Dakota lands, back toward the settlement. He recognized the slumped, defeated posture. It was Samuel Crow. Dakota had let him go. A messenger. A living testament to the power he had foolishly provoked. Eli watched until Crow was just a speck, retreating in fear from the world he now inhabited. It was the final, perfect inversion of power. The man who had held the power of life and death over him was now fleeing for his own. A gentle touch on his arm made him turn. It was Ayanna. She was no longer the fragile, injured victim from the creek bed. She stood tall, leaning on a carved walking stick, her face bright and confident. She was home. She was whole. She smiled at him, a shared look of understanding passing between them. They were the survivors. They were the children who had found each other in the wilderness and had, against all odds, forged a bond that had rewritten both their destinies. She gestured toward the camp, an invitation to begin his new life. Eli looked out at the warriors, at their silent, watchful gaze, no longer a source of terror, but of profound, soul-settling comfort. He looked at Ayanna, his sister, her presence a warm, steady anchor. He looked at the sprawling, vibrant life of the camp around him. The ache of loneliness that had been his constant companion for 3 years was gone. It had been replaced by a deep, quiet sense of purpose. He was no longer Eli Thompson, the orphan boy from the edge of town. He was Eli, son of Dakota, brother of Ayanna, protected by the warriors of the Yahanktonwan. He had been given more than a home. He had been given a name, a family, a reason. The peace he felt was not a gift freely given, but a treasure hard-earned, built one splinter of wood, one torn strip of cloth, one act of courage, one scar at a time. And as he took his first step into the heart of the camp, into the heart of his new life, he felt not like a stranger being welcomed in, but like a son, finally, truly, coming home.